Welcome to the NAFA webinar series, providing you with timely information and training on topics of interest. This is Brendan Burnett, Director, Professional Development and Education Programs. Today we are presenting Total HIPAA Compliance, your partner for information security. With me today is Jason Karn, Chief Compliance Officer at Total HIPAA Compliance. Jason is a co-author of Total HIPAA's Training and Compliance Solutions and a frequent national speaker on HIPAA and a regular HIPAA social media contributor. As Chief Compliance Officer for Total HIPAA, Jason takes a hands-on approach to assisting clients with the details of developing a well-documented HIPAA compliance plan. He has been a featured speaker for the Georgia Association of Healthcare Underwriters, National Brokers Association at their annual conference, the Columbus Association of Health Underwriters, and is the content creator and co-presenter of NewMed's 10-part webinar series on HIPAA compliance. Total HIPAA is the preferred HIPAA provider of both NAFA and NAHU, the National Association of Health Underwriters. An accomplished opera singer, Jason has performed around the world and recently made his New York City opera debut. And you can check him out on his opera website, which is jasonkarn.com. Security is one of the biggest concerns for all businesses, regardless of size or industry, and insurance carriers are now requiring agents and brokers to prove they are protecting all the information they hold. Today, Jason will explain common themes in the security protocols and provides easy ways that your agency can become compliant. During the webinar, you may type your questions in the question box on the right side of your screen. All questions will be answered during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and a webinar recording link will be emailed to all of the registrants for today's webinar. Jason, welcome.
Thank you so much, Brendan. I really appreciate it. And thanks, everybody, for joining me today. Yes, we're going to be talking about using HIPAA privacy and security standards to protect your agency. So first off here, little housekeeping. This program is educational, does not constitute, may not be construed as legal advice or creating any attorney-client relationship with any person or entity. Things that I'm going to talk about, they're changing constantly, so it's good to have talk with your legal counsel, speak with your consultants, make sure that you're on top of everything that's happening out there in the world. So things we're going to discuss today, we're going to talk about HIPAA, we're going to talk about GLBA, we're going to talk a little bit about some state privacy regulations. We've been seeing a lot more of those coming online. A little bit about GDPR and how that can affect you. How you can comply with HIPAA and GLBA, or Gramm-Leach-Bliley as you may know it. Why carriers are pushing for compliance. How to use HIPAA to protect your business, HIPAA and GLBA fines and penalties, and then some recent breaches. And then I like to always leave people with a couple things they can do. So I've got 12 things you can do today to protect your business. A real low-hanging fruit, things that'll go a long way to getting you towards HIPAA compliance and looking at Gramm-Leach-Bliley. All right, so what is HIPAA? This is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. It's been around for a while now. If you haven't heard about this, I guess you haven't been listening out there, but it's been around for a long time. We've seen it started with medical practices, expanded out. We looked at the High-Tech Act that happened in 2008. And then we're looking at the omnibus ruling, which really affects you guys. That came online in 2013. So this is all based off the National Institute of Standards and Technology Risk Management Framework. And this is 800-53. There's another one out there that's a 700 series. This is the 800-53. You'll see this a lot of times abbreviated as the NIST RMF. What we're looking to do here is protect protected health information. This constitutes two items. This has to have a medical diagnosis, a diagnosis code, some sort of medical information, as well as an identifier. So an identifier can be an email address, a name, a physical address, IP address, a MAC address. I mean, all these things constitute, put together constitutes what we call protected health information. So the goal here really is to protect your client's information. You know, we're really looking at this as business intelligence. We don't want to look at this as just, hey, this is another federal guideline. This is information that's integral to your agency to make sure that you can do business and that you're serving your clients well, and making sure you're protecting them. You know, there's studies that have come out on the medical side when they have breaches that say, you know, people don't want to use a physician if they lose their information. If you have to go to a client and say, listen, I'm really sorry we had a breach and I lost your information, or you know, your information was compromised, chances are you're going to lose that client. These studies say that almost 50% of the people will not return if you have a breach. So HIPAA is required for any medical. This includes any Medicare supplemental drug coverage, dental, vision, and long-term care insurance. Now, something I hear a lot from people is, well, I only deal in a little bit. This does not exempt you. This is probably a horrible analogy, but we use this a lot. That's like saying you're a little bit pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not. So if you're selling these types of insurance, you have to be compliant with HIPAA. There's no exception to this rule. So what is GLBA? This is Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. So this applies to all financial products. This includes your life insurance policies. This includes any casualty, property, anything that you're selling that is considered a financial product is now covered with Gramm-Leach-Bliley. This protects any non-public private information, or we say NPPI. And this does require an annual notice of privacy practices. So when it comes to non-public private information, we're looking at credit card information, we're looking at addresses, we're looking at any information that you have in your client that's not out in the public. Things that they've given you so they can, maybe it's a credit report, those kinds of things will be looked at as non-public private information. So those are all protected. Now there's an interesting thing here. If you are selling a life insurance policy, that is technically not considered, even though you have to have a physical, that's not considered a PHI under HIPAA. It's considered non-public private information under GLBA. So those are kinds of things you need to think about, but it needs to be protected the same as you will protect any information from HIPAA, as you would with HIPAA. So think about that. If you're selling any, doing any ancillary products, you're doing any other selling, you really need to be cognizant of how you're protecting that information. So other things that we're seeing out there, we're seeing a lot more state security laws. If you're from Massachusetts, you've seen the WISP program coming online. California has some pretty strong state laws. Texas has HB 300. Rhode Island now has new security laws, and Oregon has Identity Theft Protection Act. So what do these things have in common? They all are looking for training, agreements with contractors, and written security plans. If that sounds familiar to you, that's because that's just like HIPAA. So one of the nice things is if you go through a comprehensive HIPAA compliance program, you take care of all these other programs along with it. So this is a way that you can use HIPAA to leverage not only your business, a protection for your entire agency, but use this to cover other privacy concerns that you may have, privacy and security. So as we're going into this, you guys have probably heard also about the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. This is coming out of the EU. This went into effect on May 25th. This covers personally identifiable information and protects only EU citizens. So if you're not actively marketing into the EU, you probably won't need to worry about this. But I will tell you, I've got some larger clients that do serve companies that work in the EU, and they are requiring their business associates to be compliant with GDPR. So you may find, if you're working with some larger employer groups, that they're going to turn around and say, you've got to be able to prove to me that you can do this, that you can protect their personal information. And so we think, because of the reach of the EU, that this will become the standard for data protection going forward. This means that we're going to be protecting all personally identifiable information. This means email addresses, names, addresses, phone numbers, those kinds of things. And you're going to have to be able to terminate that information. Now, there are going to be some, there are a couple things in here that you need to be cognizant of. Is HIPAA requires you to maintain information for 6 years. Your insurance board may require you to keep information for up to 7 or 8 years. So if you have information that you need to maintain for those purposes, then you would maintain that information. Just because GDPR says you need to be able to terminate that information doesn't necessarily mean that takes precedent over that information. So not that you're going to come in contact with this very much, But you know, it's going to be interesting as this is litigated going forward, and we see how this is going to play out. And I think this will start to affect a lot of the privacy and security concerns that that we're seeing in the news these days. And this is going to change how we look at this information. So, you know, this is something we're really going to keep an eye on and see how this develops. So as we said earlier, and you may have seen this, we've been seeing some carrier requirements for HIPAA compliance. We've been seeing this out of Tennessee, Blue Cross Blue Shield. We've been seeing it out of South Carolina. United Healthcare of California has started, and we've also seen an audit out of Utah with United Healthcare. What are they looking for? They're looking to show, for you to either show that you have HIPAA compliance, which means policies and procedures, training your staff, notice of privacy practices, business associate agreements, all the pieces that go with this. And we'll talk a little bit more in depth about this. I know I'm just, I'll give you guys a nice story or narrative to go along with this so we can help put this together. They're looking for all that information, or what's called a SOC 2 audit. That's for Tennessee. SOC 2 is a very comprehensive, usually used by data centers. It's not a very cost-effective way for you guys to go, probably. It takes anywhere from $70,000 to $140,000 just to kick off a SOC 2 audit. It takes 2 years to complete. Year one, you do what's you create all the policies and procedures. Then year two, an accountant comes in and says, hey, let's make sure you're doing all this. And ISO 27001, which you'll see here under the Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina, that again is another incredibly comprehensive, again, usually used by data centers, not necessarily appropriate for you guys. The direction you're probably going to go is the signed attestation of HIPAA compliance by the C-suite. Now, I will warn you as you go into this, if you do not have policies and procedures and you do not have the training and all the items that go with that, you are committing perjury if you sign this agreement. Now, what are the chances you're going to be audited? We've started to see audits happening. And the thing that I would be most worried about is if you do have a breach and you do have to report that to the carrier may turn around and audit you and see where you are. And that can open you up to additional liability. So those are things to think about. So we need, you know, and HIPAA compliance is probably going to be, not even probably, is the cheapest way to go about this. It's going to be the most comprehensive and yet the most cost effective for your agency. We've seen out of California, we've had 2 clients right now who are undergoing, one is undergoing an online assessment questionnaire. And then we have, actually, I'm reading this, we have 2 people now that are undergoing random online audits. This means they actually have to do a screen share with a security officer from United Healthcare. I'm going to be sitting in one of those audits in the next month, so it's going to be really interesting to see what they're looking for exactly and how that's going to move forward. But we expect this is going to spread throughout. Now, you may wonder why this is happening. Think back to the Anthem breach that happened a couple of years ago. It's estimated that's costing Anthem anywhere from $50 to $70 million to remedy that breach. And that's not even from any HIPAA fines and penalties. That's just from the costs and the class action suits that are going on and things that are going to end up being settled out of this. So a lot of these carriers are looking for cybersecurity policies. If you guys are in casualty and property and casualty, you're probably dealing with a lot more cybersecurity policies than you ever have before. That's because of these breaches that are happening. So they're looking for ways to mitigate those costs. And one of the ways to do that is to make sure the agents that work with them are HIPAA compliant. So that shows that you guys are taking responsibility for this. So that's why we're seeing this uptick in, hey, the carriers are making sure the agents who are selling these products are HIPAA compliant. It gives them an extra level of protection. So as we said, HIPAA gives you a protection plan. This is more than a group of federal and state privacy requirements. This is a way for you to do business going forward. I can't stress this enough. I know if you read the news, you see hackings every day. You see a breach almost every other day. I was actually just reading an article today that we're about to post. That's just this year so far, we've had 157 breaches that have been reported to HHS. Now, a report to HHS means that either these were, and some of these are very large breaches. We've seen over, 200,000. We've seen many over 500. So if they're over 500, they have to be reported to HHS within 60 days. So this is a lot of information that's getting out, and this is why this is so important. Now, I like to give you guys a little bit of a narrative here because I think, I can talk to you about the regulations. I can talk to you about why this is so important, but I think a nice story is kind of fun. And this reminds me, I was actually in Germany about a year ago and saw all these really cool walled cities. And I was thinking of a fun analogy to talk about security. And I think, HIPAA compliance and a walled town or walled village is kind of a great narrative or story here to tell. So, back in medieval times, everybody had to protect themselves, and they did it physically by having walls, moats, bridges, towers, and then they would post their soldiers around to protect, all the things, the civilians inside, and all their intelligence, all their goods and whatnot. And I think that's actually a pretty good analogy for what we're trying to do here. So, they were up against the Mongols, they were up against, all these warring tribes, or, maybe their neighbor coming in, and you're up against hackers, malware, ransomware. You've seen a lot of employee mistakes. Unfortunately, I wish I could say that this never happens, but we have seen and heard of malicious employees taking information or doing things, and then disasters. We're seeing a lot more storms. We're seeing a lot of power outages, those sorts of things that are causing major problems. And so we want to make sure these are all things that HIPAA is there to help protect you. So how do you prepare? Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to understand where your vulnerabilities are. It's kind of putting the cart before the horse if you just start saying, I'm going to start creating plans without knowing what you've got. So you've got to conduct a risk assessment. This is a requirement under HIPAA. You have to have this. If you do have an audit that happens by HHS, if you have the state attorney general, if you have an insurance board coming to talk to you, if you have a carrier coming to look at you, the first thing they're going to ask for is your risk assessment. This is going to tell you administratively who's in charge. Physically, how do you physically protect that information? A lot of us are moving away from paper documents, but you may have old records that are paper records. How are you physically protecting that information? How are you physically protecting any electronic devices you have? And then technically, how will you stop that enemy from crossing your wall? How are you keep them out of your firewall, out of your network, out of your server, out of your cloud provider, whatever? How are you going to do this? And this is what that risk assessment does. This is a very detailed document and should be. And this will probably take a bit of time to do. You're going to be looking at these three major parts. And this is incredibly important because this lays the blueprint for everything you're going to do going forward. So now you know where your holes are. Now you know where your problems are. So you've got to start coming up with a compliance plan. Now, you have to have two pieces to this compliance plan, both privacy and security. These are both separate laws that were put into place at different times as the HIPAA laws evolved, and you have to have both. This is all the information that you've gathered in that risk assessment, and you need to lay out how you're going to deal with information that comes in. Who has access to what? What do you do when there's a breach? Who do you contact? How you're going to configure your firewalls? How you're going to look at your network? These are incredibly detailed documents that lay out exactly how you're going to do this. It's very important that you have these documents, and it's very important these are updated regularly. This is not something that you just print out. You get a template from from somebody on the internet, and you say, great. You put your name on it, and then you stick it on the shelf. And if somebody walks in, you go, oh yeah, we have a plan. If you have a plan and you're not following it, it's the same as not having a plan, which is fairly obvious. But this is incredibly important that you look at it and you say, is this going to work for us? How does this work? What are we doing here? So this plan may evolve. You may start off with a policy that states, how you're going to restrict information to certain people in your office. You discover that does not work for your flow, so you need to change that policy. Well, that needs to be updated, and you need to be able to show that if you're ever audited, that you have a history of compliance. That means that you may have 5, 6, 10, 20 iterations of these plans so that you can show, hey, we saw this policy, We initially put it in, it didn't work, so we decided we changed it, and this is what we documented. So if you're not doing what you document, again, that's the same as not having a plan. So now we need to reinforce your wall. So what are we looking for here? We're looking for network security. So we're all dependent on the internet these days. You guys are watching me on the internet right now. So we need to make sure we have firewalls in place. Whether that's a hardware firewall or that's a software firewall or both, they need to be in place. A firewall will, as it sounds like, will protect that, protect any information from coming the wrong way. So this will keep people out of your network theoretically, and this is the best way to protect yourself. You can set these up very easily. If you guys are a small agency, your devices will have these built in. Your operating systems have them natively built in, or you can use a third party. It doesn't matter. If you want to use a Kaspersky or you want to use Sophos or whatever, you can do that. It's fine just as long as you have it. Your router from your carrier does technically have a firewall on it, but it's not a very smart firewall. So that won't suffice. You really need to make sure you have a software firewall. And if you're a larger company, you want to make sure you have a configured dynamic firewall that will look and scan information. Anti-malware software is incredibly important. If anybody here is on a Mac, you can't surf the web without anti-malware software anymore. It doesn't matter what you're using. For Mac, I find Sophos to be very low on the on using resources. So I think that's the program we use here internally. I like, but just as long as you have a program, that's important, and that it's updated regularly. Off-site backups, you want to make sure you can get at stuff if you have a physical damage to your site, you lose a device. I wish I could say I've never lost a device in my life. I have lost too many, and backups have been the key to getting myself back up and running. We want to look at electronic device security, who has access to desktops, laptops, tablets, smartphones, how we're physically securing those, how we're electronically securing those. Are you requiring passwords? How often are you changing those passwords? Who's able to access those devices? These are important things to think about. You can't just hand somebody a laptop and say, go sell insurance. You really need to put some thought process into how they're accessing, what kind of information they're storing on those devices, and how you're protecting them. And then we want to look at facility security. These are things that, fire suppression, security alarms. Are you using any, keys? Are you using key fobs? How are you securing? Do you have a security person? Do you not have a security person? How do you physically secure your facility? That's really important. So step number 4 is you got everything locked down. That's great, but you have to be able to communicate. If you can't get out and communicate, then it's no good. And so how do you communicate effectively? How do you communicate to make sure that the people that are supposed to be reading information are getting information? So this means communicating with your clients using encrypted email. Whether you guys get a portal or whether you're sending an encrypted email out, it doesn't matter. Just make sure you have that in place. It's always helpful too if you have something on your website. That's where a portal might come in handy. But it's really helpful if you have a way for a client to initiate an email conversation with you that will be encrypted to start with. So whether that's a link in an email that you have that says, here, send me something encrypted, or as I said, a portal on the website might be a good way to go about that. But you want to make sure that your clients can talk to you and say, hey, what does my coverage look like if, we have a cancer diagnosis in the family? What does our coverage look like? What are we dealing with here? Or, what do I need to think about? And with your larger groups, they may say, hey, we're seeing some interesting information on our census, with the census information. You want to make sure that that information is encrypted in transit, and rest, and in storage. And encryption is your best friend, actually, in everything that I'm going to talk about here today. HIPAA compliant faxing. Faxing is still considered HIPAA compliant. We always suggest that people go to an electronic faxing solution. At least that it's encrypted in storage and in transit. You can use a machine, but make sure you pre-program any numbers you may be sending information to. Texting, that's a really dicey situation. There are some providers out there that will allow for HIPAA compliant texting, but your general run-of-the-mill texting is not HIPAA compliant. So if you're texting with people, try to keep PHI out of those texts. So don't say, hey, you know, Bob's looking at, you know, whatever his coverage is for his, you know, whatever disease. You don't want to put that into a text because it's very easy for that to be intercepted, and then it can be read at any point. So that is not usually a good way to do it. There are programs you can sign up with that will allow texting, but right now that's not a good way to go. Chat, yeah, you can, but again, make sure that is a HIPAA compliant solution, which means a business associate agreement with that company. File sharing, great to use. Again, you need to have a business associate agreement, Box, Dropbox, Google Drive, any of those. Office 365 is great. And then video conferencing. Again, be really careful about this. Just using Skype out of the box is not a good way to go. You need to make sure you have the business associate agreement and that you've covered, that you make sure that they actually are HIPAA compliant and that they are protecting your information. Step number 5 is train your Army. Your plan is only as good as each soldier's preparation. So we talk about this a lot with IT about not developing in spite of, you know, don't develop in spite of your employees. If your employees can't use the system or it's not effective to use and it's going to create too many problems, they will not use it. So we need to make sure that you develop the plan and a process that's really going to make, it's going to not be too much of a burden on the staff. It's going to change some of their processes and you're going to hear complaining left and right, but you've got to come up with a process. You've got to protect the information and you need to get them on board. So, you know, talk to your employees, see what works best for them, and then say, well, you know, we have to do this because of this, you know, this regulation. So let's see if we can make this easier for you. There are a lot of easy ways to develop. There are some great email encryption programs that actually that will work right in your email client. So it makes it really easy to use these programs. These are the kinds of things that you want to think about as ways to just really make it easy for everybody to use the tools and the policies that you're coming up with. So now you know what you're doing, and now we need to secure your assets. So we need to encrypt information that you hold. So encryption is key. Now, I know everybody's going to tell me, hey, encryption is not required by HIPAA. Well, how this was written back in 2008, 2009 was that it is considered an optional item, but what they say is you have to do a risk assessment and determine whether encryption is right for you or not. I have done probably thousands of risk assessments, and I will tell you, I've never had an instance where a client has come to me and said, well, we shouldn't do encryption here. That never happens. There is no reason that you shouldn't be doing this. It's a lot of negatives in a sentence, but there's no reason to not have encryption on your computers. Windows has BitLocker built in. It is free to use. It'll encrypt your information. Just make sure you store those keys. Talk to your IT person before you do this, but this is an important thing to have in place. File Vault 2 is on Macs, easy to do. You have to turn on encryption on your Android devices, iPhones, iPads are natively encrypted. Just make sure they're password protected. These are things that are low-hanging fruit but incredibly important. This protects you if you lose that device and it's password protected and it's encrypted. It is not considered a breach, and you do not have to report it. And that is a huge weight off your shoulders. The fact that all you have to do is either erase that device remotely, or you can just say, well, chances are nobody's going to be able to get into it, but you don't have to report that as a breach. You don't have to call your clients and tell them you lost all their information. That is worth its weight in gold. So, and then step number 2 is backup, backup, backup. With everything going on, you have to be able to go back, and not just yesterday. You may need to go back 3, 4, 5 weeks because you may have been hacked and you didn't realize it, and they were just doing something low grade on your computer, maybe sniffing out a couple passwords here, maybe grabbing a little information there before it took over. So that is really why you need to have backups, and you need to have a lot of backups. You know, personally, I keep the end of every year, and I keep a couple months, even going into a new year. So I have about 6 months of backups that I can revert to, and then I can even revert back a whole year. I can actually revert back about 3 or 4 years at this point. So not that I ever would do that, but if it became a problem or became an issue, that's what you need to have. And that's kind of a rough idea of what you need to do, sort of, you know, what a HIPAA compliance plan is going to look like and what you're going to do here. So just so you guys know, as I talk about this, what the real world costs are. So the average cost, and this is from 2017, this is the Poneman Institute, which works with IBM, and they go and they look at all this stuff, has found that each breached record is worth about $221. It's going to cost you about $221. So, you know, let's say you have 100 clients that are breached. All of a sudden, you're looking at a huge bill. And you're looking at, oh my gosh, what am I dealing with here? And you've got, you know, your root causes, you've got malicious or criminal attacks, you've got system glitches, and 23% of this is human error, which goes back to that, let's train everybody and make sure that people are doing the right things. This could be simply, you know, somebody fat fingers a text, or excuse me, fat fingers a fax and sends it to the wrong person. We just saw that not a couple weeks ago. A hospital was sending out faxes to the wrong people and sending out information. You know, these kinds of things happen. It doesn't even have to be a malicious act. They could just make a mistake. They could be emailing somebody and be emailing the wrong person or send the wrong information, you know, wrong information out. We saw recently that there was envelopes that were sent out where you could actually see an HIV diagnosis. It was sent from a carrier to people, and there was a major breach that came out of this. You know, those are the kinds of things that we're going to see there, and you know, these are common human errors. People make mistakes, so we want to try to do as much as we can to mitigate that. So, ways to decrease the cost of a breach is having an incident response plan. This means that you've already know that, you know, I was actually talking to Brendan about this earlier, is it's not if you're going to be hacked or if you're going to have a breach, it's when you get hacked and when you're going to have a breach. And I know that sounds a little pessimistic, but in this world, you know, if somebody really wants to get at your information, they're going to get it. You know, they're smart enough, there's enough things out there. So what you want to do is make sure you have a plan on how to respond to this. The reason that saves you time and money is you don't have to amp up and think, oh my God, what are we going to do in this situation? And you spend, you know, 10 days coming up with a response plan versus we have a response plan. We just need to modify that to fit what we need, what we have now. Extensive use of data encryption. I'm going to say this probably a million times before this is over. So I'm going to, you know, hopefully when you walk away from this webinar, you're going to say, the guy kept talking about encryption. I need to make sure all my stuff is encrypted. And I will walk away thinking that I have accomplished something great. This is as I said, very easy to do, very easy to turn on, and it saves you so much time, will save you so many headaches in the future if you have any problems. I mean, there was an example not too long ago of a hospital that was infected with malware. Their systems were encrypted, so they were encrypting already encrypted information. So when it came down to it, there wasn't a breach because the information was already encrypted. So yes, they weren't necessarily able to get back to their information, but at least they didn't, that information wasn't compromised. It just had another layer of encryption on top of it. And then I've talked to you about employee training, but yes, how important that is. You know, training an employee lets them know, even if a mistake is made or even if malware comes on, gets onto a system, at least you know, they know, hey, I know I'm supposed to contact Bob over in IT if something weird is happening with my computer. Something weird is happening. I'm not sure what's going on here. Let me get in touch with IT. That simple little, you know, moment can save you a lot of headaches, because it may be that you can unplug that from the network before it has a chance to pass through to other computers, other devices, and then you're dealing with only one device that's compromised instead of an entire network. And then use of data loss prevention software. Again, backups. If you can't revert back, you know, you're just a sitting duck. You're a target. Again, I've lost so many drives. I've lost so much information along the way. Luckily, I have great backups. I keep both local and cloud backup systems. In this day and age, the barrier for getting in is so low. You're crazy not to do it. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the hacks and some of the data breaches we've seen in the last couple of years. And we talked a little bit about the Anthem hack. As you guys see, this is the largest civil settlement that we've seen to date. That's $115 million that cost them. So I was wrong. I said earlier it was 50 to 70 million. I was off a little bit there. The Sony hack. Now, I'm not saying that you guys are going to get hacked by a country, but you know, crazier things have happened. And supposedly the North Koreans and the Chinese are out there. They're looking for anything that they can get on people. We're not sure what their end game is, but you know, they had over 435,000 employees that were hacked in the Sony hack, or employees whose information was compromised. They ended up paying out about $1,000 to $3,000 per settlement. Some were paid as much as $10,000, depending on what information was stolen. Triple S Management, they had a $3.5 million fine. St. Joseph's Health is another one, and then Advocate Healthcare. So we've seen a lot of large fines, and I expect, you know, we've now been starting to see our first fines that are coming out are from state attorney generals, which are also allowed to prosecute for HIPAA. And I expect in the next couple of months, we're going to start seeing some carriers pulling agreements from agents because they will said they're HIPAA compliant. They'll do an audit, they'll discover they're not, and then they're going to start pulling those contracts. So it's something to think about. You know, can you afford, if a Blue Cross Blue Shield said to you, you know, you can't prove to us that you're HIPAA compliant, so we're going to pull that contract with you. Could your agency withstand that? And so I would venture to say that no, that would not bode well for your agency. And so becoming HIPAA compliant would probably be in your best interest if you're not already. So who regulates HIPAA and GLB? So HIPAA is Health and Human Services, and then the Office of Civil Rights is actually who investigates and goes and looks at everything. It also can be prosecuted by the state attorney general, and then legal action. We've now seen in 4 states, HIPAA is now held as a standard of care, which means they can sue you under a malpractice suit. This has been upheld in North Carolina. This is in Indianapolis, New Hampshire, and Vermont. We're expecting this will pass on. These are state Supreme Courts that have upheld this and saying that, yes, you can expect that your information will be kept private. There is also some recent information that's come out that said that OCR might start sharing those fines with patients. So if you have clients whose information is compromised, there's a HIPAA breach, you are fined, they might pass some of those finances or that money on to clients. So that's also going to push up and say, hey, you know, we need to start, you know, people might start saying, hey, I'm going to start suing people for this. And then GLBA is the FTC. And we've seen almost 30 cases since 2017. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit here about what the fines and penalties look like. We're doing great on time. I was actually just looking, I thought we were a little bit short on time. I've got it, but we'll keep going here. So as you can see here, we have did not know. At this point, it's really hard to say you didn't know what was going on. So I like to say this is, if we had, let's say we had a mythical spreadsheet that had 100 names on it. If you did not know, you could be looking at a minimum at a $10,000 fine for losing that spreadsheet. Reasonable cause means you tried to be HIPAA compliant, you had a couple of holes, maybe, you know, things weren't quite the way they were supposed to be. You missed a bunch of items. That is $1,000 to $50,000. All of these cap at $1.5 million a year. Willful neglect corrected means that you didn't do anything. You didn't have a HIPAA compliance plan, but when HHS, OCR, or State Attorney General came in, you then turned around and you have 60 days to correct this. You corrected, but still you're looking at $10,000 to $50,000 a fine, capped at $1.5 million. And willful neglect is, hey, you knew you didn't have anything, you decided you weren't going to mitigate anything, and you thumbed your nose at HHS. That's $50,000 fine per violation with a cap of $1.5 million. Now I'm going to backtrack here for just a second here because you see all these huge fines that are coming in here, especially the Triple S management fine. That was actually a HIPAA fine. And the reason that these are so large is, you remember when I was talking about all the different parts that go into HIPAA? So you're looking at policies and procedures, risk assessment, training, notice of privacy practices, business, you know, all these different pieces that go with this. This means that these people had more than one infraction. So it wasn't just losing a spreadsheet. It was losing a spreadsheet, not having policies and procedures, maybe not training staff, you know, and it was all these different items. And then they've settled and said, you know, we'll pay a $3.5 million fine. rather than dealing with each one individually, because each one of those would have been capped at $1.5 million. And, you know, if you have 10 different things, that could be a $10 million plus fine that you're receiving. So they'll usually negotiate that down to a more reasonable, I say that tongue in cheek, more reasonable fine. But, you know, that's something to keep in mind also, is if you don't have multiple items on the list of things that you need to have, you could be open to some pretty serious fines. There are criminal penalties too. So we've been seeing this a lot more now. We've seen our first people being prosecuted for this. These are people taking information and, you know, using it for personal gain. So knowingly obtaining or disclosing is a $50,000 fine, 1 year in prison, $100,000 for offenses under false pretenses, and then intent to sell is $250,000 plus 10 years in prison. As you can see, these are for people. These penalties are for companies, not for individuals. So if you were a privacy officer and there was an issue that happened, that's not going to come back and bite you personally. That's unless you were doing something criminal, then we'll be talking about these criminal penalties. So when it comes to GLBA or Gramm-Leach-Bliley, you can lose your license to practice if you have a fine. You will be fined up to $100,000 per violation. This one's a little bit different. So officers and directors can be fined up to $10,000 per violation. So if you have multiple violations, you know, you can be fined as an individual, especially if you're a C-level individual and you signed off on items. Fines will be doubled if there's a pattern or of illegal activity involving more than $100,000 within 12 months. And you can be imprisoned up to 10 years. And any criminal penalties also include imprisonment up to 5 years, a fine, or both. Now, if you have a violation for HIPAA and you have a violation with Gramm-Leach-Bliley, those will be prosecuted separately. So you could be fined by OCR and you could be fined by the FTC for both these items. So this is something to keep in mind, that you've got to look at both these items. But doing HIPAA compliance by and large will take care of your Gramm-Leach-Bliley problems or issues that may arise. So this is something that we do recommend, even if you're looking at, if you only sell a little bit of health insurance and you mainly do property casualty or do financial products, then yeah, you definitely want to look at doing HIPAA compliance, and that will give you an overarching security plan. So here's what I want to leave you with today. I've got just a few more minutes here on my presentation. Then I'm going to open up the floor to some questions here. Hope you guys haven't scared anybody too much. But here are 12 things you can do today, or our little 12-step program here to end us off today. So number one is appoint a HIPAA privacy and security officer. This needs to be a management level, doesn't have to be the owner of the agency, just needs to have somebody who has the ability to sanction and potentially suspend and or fire employees. So you want to make sure this is somebody of management level. You don't want this to be your front desk or this needs to be an administrator. This can be the same person, doesn't have to be two separate people. Privacy is mainly going to look at administrative, and physical. Security officer is going to be more technical. If you use somebody in the office that does not have any, technical experience, is not an IT person, that is fine. They can delegate to whomever they want. Just make sure that you have your IT, either person or vendor involved in the process. That'll make things go a lot smoother when it comes to HIPAA compliance. But make sure you have that person assigned. This is the third or fourth time I've mentioned this, but turn on encryption and password protection for all digital devices. Your iPhone, now we use biometrics with a lot of these. That's fine. Make sure every time you turn these things on that you have to put in a password or use biometrics. Any Android phone, same deal. Face recognition is fine too. When you're looking at your laptop devices, timeouts, set them for a max of 10 minutes. You should have to log in every 10 minutes that you haven't touched that screen. So if you walk away and you forget to log out of your computer, it'll log out for you. So set those timeouts, make sure that they're active, but make sure you have encrypted and password protect your digital devices. Also, really important is when you turn on the encryption, make sure you're storing those encryption keys somewhere safe. Don't store it with the computer. Don't store it, in the desk drawer next to you, not locked up. You should store those either with your IT person. They can either digitally secure those. You can store those with Apple. You can store them with Google. You can put them in a safe deposit box, but make sure the password and the encryption keys are not with the device themselves, because that's just means that you've gone through all that trouble and it's not going to give you any protection. So that's really important. And also, if you turn on encryption for any of your devices, make sure you have a good backup before you do this. Your Android devices, I recommend that you do any encryption overnight, because if you stop it in midstream, it will turn your phone into a brick, which is what it sounds like. It's about as good as a brick. You can reload everything from the start. That's why you need to make sure you have a good backup. But make sure you have those on, and make sure you're encrypting those backups. Turn on auto lock all digital devices. Sign up for an email encryption program. As I put on here down at the bottom, that little asterisk, BA agreements are required for these programs. File sharing, encrypted file sharing, it's a great way to share things. If you're using jump drives, flash drives, stop that. Go to file sharing. Much easier, much more secure. Easier for you to store your information and keep track of your information. It'll be easier for IT to see who's accessing, who's been looking at information, and make sure you can restrict access to that. It's better than having a flash drive that can get lost in 5 seconds, and that happens more often than not. Turn on software firewall and computer operating systems. Now, I do caution, talk to your IT person before you do this. You don't want to screw up any of your access or network access, but this should be turned on. And make sure you set this to whitelist. There's 2 different ways to configure your firewall. You can either whitelist or blacklist. Blacklist means you need to know everybody and all the bad IP addresses coming to you. Whitelist means all access is denied and that you have to grant them access. So it should be set to whitelist. Make a list of all your business associates your company uses. So this means anybody this would be your cloud service provider, your IT person, if you're using a vendor, would be considered would be a business associate. Any contract employees would technically be business associates. You need to actually have business associate agreements with your employer groups. You are considered a business associate to them. They are a covered entity because their health plan is a covered entity. You've already signed a business associate agreement with your carrier. If not, currently, you may receive a new one from them in the next couple of weeks or the next couple of months, depending on when your agreements come up for renewal, but you have signed one with them. So think about anybody who might be coming in contact with PHI. Those are your business associates, and you need to have agreements with them. So make sure you sign those. Those should be countersigned agreements, and those go, they will look for those. If there is ever an audit that happens, people will be looking to see if you have those agreements and that they are countersigned. Make a list of all the places you have PHI stored in your company, both physical and electronic. So we're looking for any paper files that might be in file rooms, might be on devices. You need to also look and see if people are downloading anything locally. So that would be storing on an internal hard drive instead of keeping things in a, if you guys are using a CRM for storing information about your clients, making sure that they don't download any PHI onto their device. I know we work with a lot of companies that keep things in CRMs because it's easier to manage. But then we come to find out that sometimes when employees need to print things, they download things locally onto unencrypted devices, and it becomes a real headache for control. So, make a list of all the places that you have PHI or potentially could have PHI. This is a big one, and I haven't talked about this yet today, but this is important also. Change all your weak passwords. If any of your passwords are under 8 characters and do not contain an uppercase, lowercase letter, a special character, and some numbers, they are weak, and they need to be changed yesterday. It takes, you can go on websites, you can see how long it takes a password to be hacked. A 6-character password takes something about 30 to 45 seconds for a modern computing system with a password cracker to hack, which means they will get into your systems really fast. So you want to make sure that your passwords are over 8 characters. I use 12 to 15 characters. Sometimes I use even 20, depending on the security of the system that I need. And start thinking about using two-factor authentication too. That's another way you can look at protecting your devices. So a strong password and then a two-factor authentication means that you use a second device to log in, like a Google Authenticator. And this means you would need to use your iPhone or your Android phone to receive either a texted code, or you use an authenticator, which gives you a secondary code to say, yes, I am who I say I am. A lot of your IT folks will use this if you're trying to remote into a system or remote into a server, will require this. So you've probably seen this before, but if not, this is a really great way to help secure your systems. Number 11 is, I really like password management programs. I've got so many different passwords going on here, and I'm sure everybody else does. This is great. I use LastPass, OnePass. There are a couple out there that are great. They're very, very affordable, do a great job of storing that information. Just make sure that main password you have is incredibly difficult. And then number 12 is train all your employees. That is probably the most important thing, is making sure your employees know what's going on. So I have thrown a ton of information at you guys. And I'm going to open up the floor to some questions here. So Brendan, how are we doing here?
We're doing well. Thanks, Jason. We're going to pause for a few moments to enable our attendees to ask some questions by typing those questions in the question box on the right side of the screen. And in fact, we already do have some questions in the queue. What percentage of agencies are HIPAA compliant?
That's negotiable. I mean, I've spoken to a couple of people out of Tennessee in particular, because of this Blue Cross Blue Shield request that they prove that they're HIPAA compliant and sign these agreements. I would venture to say I would be surprised if 15 to 20% are HIPAA compliant. I think a lot of people have given this lip service, have not really looked at this closely. In the groups that I talk to, they tend to smile at me and go, yeah, sure, I'm HIPAA compliant, and then walk on. So I would be surprised if it was 15 to 20% of people are actually HIPAA compliant.
And on what are you basing your statement that agencies that do not institute some sort of security standard will be disenfranchised?
Yeah, so this is based off of what we're seeing, the letters that we're seeing from United Healthcare, Blue Cross Blue Shield, both in Tennessee and South Carolina. They have openly stated that if you cannot prove HIPAA compliance, or you will not sign the attestation saying that you are HIPAA compliant, that they will consider termination of your contract. So this is what the carriers are saying, and as I said earlier, we're expecting this to expand outward. We did have a conversation with the National NAHU legal counsel, and he wouldn't give us exact dates, but he said, yes, this is expanding out to other states. So I expect in the next couple of months, maybe in the next 6 to 8 months, that we're going to see more states start to bring this to the forefront.
And 2 requests for recommendations. First of all, any recommendations for encryption software? And who would you suggest for secure email for a very small agency?
Okay. For encrypting your encryption software, if you're on a PC, it's built in. As long as you're on Windows 8 and above, if you're Windows 10, it's part of the plan. I think Windows 7 only if you're in the enterprise and I want to say ultimate level, and that is called BitLocker. BITLOCKER. It's built into your computer program, easy to use, free. If you do not have that, I know that Sophos, SOPHOS, will do it. Kaspersky will do it. Most of your malware programs will do that. If you are on a Mac, it's called File Vault 2. So that's file vault #2, and that's built into your system also. And that will run in the background, and it won't slow down your computer at all. When it comes to email encryption, the program that we like the best here is, and we don't receive any kickback on this, so I can say this without any bias here, is Virtru, VIRTRU is the name of the company. I'm not sure what their pricing is at this point, but it used to be in the $6 to $8 range per license per user per month. They do have a free level, but you have to pay to get to to get them to sign a business associate agreement, which is required for that. And I have a couple other programs that I like. Protected Trust is another one, and these are all can be found on my website. It's Total HIPAA, HIPAA.com, and that's under our resources. And then we've got a bunch of different resources. So if you're looking for, if you need an IT vendor, I've got some recommended IT vendors. We do have encryption programs, as well as file sharing programs and some backup programs on there also.
And you mentioned OnePass. What was the other company for passwords again?
LastPass. That's the one that currently I use. Last, LASTPASS.
Okay.
And I've got a link to them on my website also. But they're a great program. One of the nice things is if you get into a business plan, you can actually monitor your employees as to, you won't be able to see their passwords, but you can look at password strength that they have, and you can tell them to renew, like say this password needs to be fixed, that sort of stuff. So from an IT standpoint, that's great. They're a really solid company. I've been really happy with the program. It works really, really well, and it helps me come up with unique passwords for all of my different things for credit cards, personal stuff, as well as business items. So it's a great program. And I think it's like $12 a year per user or something like that, or 20. No, it's 24. It's $2 a month per user at this point, I think.
And we have a question on the distribution of this webinar. The webinar will be emailed out to all the registrants. It's a link to access and view the webinar, and it will be sent out to the email addresses that you used at the time that you registered for the webinar. Next question, why does it take so long to institute a SOC2 or ISO 27001 audit?
Well, the reason it takes so long is that first, the SOC 2 and the ISO 27001 are both they're both security standards. The reason it takes so long is it takes a full year to put policies and procedures in place and to then watch them work. So what they do is they give you what's called a SOC 2 Type 1 plan, which is this is your actual policies and procedures. And then the accountant comes back, or your IT professional comes back and looks at everything that you've done over the last year, sees, and says, okay, this is what you've done, this is how you did it. And then they sign off and they say, okay, Acme Incorporated did this, this is how this worked, this didn't work, this is what we did to mitigate this. And then you have to go back almost quarterly and adjust those plans as you go. That's part of the reason why I say for smaller companies, this is probably not the way to go. If you're only billing, say $150,000 a year, you don't want to waste 70,000 of that or 80,000. You might be able to find somebody to do it for maybe less than 70, but I would doubt it. You don't want to waste over half of your revenue just trying to put a security plan in place, when a HIPAA compliance plan can cost you a fraction of that. A HIPAA compliance plan, depending on whether you do it yourself or if you use a vendor like us, it would be somewhere around $2,000 for a year. So that's a huge difference in pricing on that.
And the last question that we have, you mentioned a few states that have been notified by BCBS or United Healthcare. Will this requirement be instituted in other states?
Yes. Yes. The answer is yes, it will. And we're not exactly sure when this is going to march out, but we expect that this is going to happen within the next year. That the other Blue Crosses and Blue Cross Blue Shields are going to step forward and say, hey, we're going to start requiring this of our folks also, because they're going to be looking to to get those cybersecurity policies, and they're going to be looking for ways to mitigate their costs. And, you know, it's just like having a fire alarm in your house. You know, if you can show that the people who have access to your information are compliant with HIPAA and protecting information, then that gives you a lower cost on your property insurance, just like it would with your cybersecurity insurance. So we expect this is going to be pushed out within the next year.
Great. Well, that's all the questions we have, and also about all the time we have. Any parting thoughts, Jason?
I just want to say, you know, thank you so much for having us today. We do have a special coupon for you guys as a NAFA member. If you use NAFA at GLBA, you will receive a 10% off discount. If you can't remember that, just email us at info@totalhipaa, or you can see on our website at totalhipaa.com. We'll be happy to pass on that discount, but that's a nice little discount for any of your members to use. And if you have any questions, also, we're happy to talk to anybody about their HIPAA compliance needs. You know, don't be shy, and don't, you know, we all need to do this, and whether you've done it or not is, as a, you know, a moot point at this juncture, but it's really important that we move forward. If you need to move forward, or you think you need to move forward with this, that you get with a vendor, and we'd love to have an opportunity to try to help anybody out who needs help.
Great. Thank you, Jason Karn, and thank you to all of the NAFA members that participated on today's webinar. This concludes the webinar.